Good evening, and welcome to Graphic Entanglements, Assessments, and Entwinements, a visual culture program roundtable. I am Erika Piola, Director of the Visual Culture Program, as well as tonight's moderator. But before I begin my more formal remarks, I want to take a moment to thank the late William H. Helfand and Michael Leja and the Terra Foundation for funding the fellowships of tonight's presenters. Without their support, we would not be here. So a wholehearted thank you from me, the Visual Culture Program, and the Library Company, which leads me to, for those not familiar with the Library Company, or as a refresher, we are an independent research library specializing in American history and culture from the 17th through the early 20th centuries. We have over 1 million books, graphic materials, pieces of ephemera, and art and artifacts in our holdings. Among our several collecting strengths is visual culture. And in response, the library started the Visual Culture Program over a decade ago. Its mission is to promote visual literacy and the creative use of historical images as primary sources for studying the past, the history of our social construction of the visual, and the mass visual culture of the nation, before 1950 through exhibitions, research fellowships, publications, acquisitions, digital projects, and public programs such as tonight's event. I'm so delighted to be here this evening with 3 women scholars to talk about their work focused on intersections of visual culture and contemporary and past socio-political issues that society has, is, and will continue to grapple with and confront. Environmental degradation, accessible healthcare, and Indigenous land rights. Tonight, we aim to foster a conversation focused on the importance of our visual world and understanding the present as seen in the past and vice versa. It is my pleasure to introduce these most learned women, have them speak a few moments about their work in the order in which they were introduced, and then start our roundtable. Relatedly, to ask a question during and after the discussion, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. With that said, let me start the introductions. Andrea Krupp is a visual artist and independent researcher and was one of our 2022-2023 Program in Visual Culture Terra Foundation Fellows in American Popular Graphic Arts. She's a graduate of the University of the Arts with a BFA with honors in printmaking. Her current interdisciplinary project, Seeing Coal, combines archival research with coal-based materials and pigments to explore and comment on energy culture. Her artwork is held in the collections of the Ballinglen Museum of Contemporary Art, Woodmere Art Museum, the Free Library of Philadelphia, and the Nevada Museum of Art Center for Art and the Environment. Andrea's work and research has been supported by the Independence Foundation, the Ballinglen Arts Foundation, the Arctic Circle, and the Library Company of Philadelphia. Alexis Monroe, also one of our 2022-2023 Program in Visual Culture Terra Foundation Fellows in American Popular Graphic Arts, is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, specializing in the art, literature, and history of the 19th century American West. Her research has been supported by the Amon Carter Museum of American Art, the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Her article on the historiographic significance of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad appears in the fall 2022 issue of American Art. And last but certainly not least is Philippa Pitts, our 2022-2023 William H. Helfand Fellow in American Visual Culture. She's also a PhD candidate and Horowitz Foundation Fellow for American Art at Boston University. She returned to doctoral work after a decade of museum practice, having held positions at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Museum of Fine Arts Boston, Portland Museum of Art, and Portland Art Museum. Philippa's writing has appeared in Panorama, the Journal of Museum Education, and Museums, etc. Her research has been supported by Winterthur, the American Antiquarian Society, the William H. Clements Library, Oak Springs Garden Foundation, and the Library Company of Philadelphia. I want to welcome you, ladies, and now I will turn the screen over to Andrea to start our discussion and to learn about her and our other panelist projects.
Thank you, Erika. Okay, let me share my screen and get my party started. Oh, what's all this? Right. Okay, and I think I have to close. Hang on a sec. I have to close this little, are you seeing a pop-up window that says attendees?
Nope, you're all good, Andrea.
Oh, okay, it's just blocking my view. It's very weird. It must be a setting on my Zoom. Okay, in any case, this is the first slide. So thank you, Erika. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you. I'm in Iceland right now. I'd like to say thank you also to the Library Company and to the Terra Foundation for this fellowship and for this opportunity to bring my visual artist perspective to tonight's roundtable discussion. My research project is a creative exploration of Pennsylvania anthracite coal that combines historical visual culture research, field research in coal mining regions, and studio work. In my artwork, I'm centering anthracite coal and its unique aesthetic, visual, and material qualities to comment on and help contextualize my personal experience of the here and now, and also contribute to the cultural imaginary of a post-fossil fuel energy future. I began my research in 2019 by focusing on the history of anthracite coal mining in Pennsylvania and graphic depictions of coal as it lie underground, such as the one shown here. That work was summarized in a 2021 exhibition called Seeing Coal, Time and Material Scale, held at the Library Company. This image is one of the highlights of my recent research fellowship. The Library Company's collection of Aero Service photographs show Philadelphia in the early 20th century from a bird's eye view, which is a unique and rare perspective of a coal and soot darkened past before environmental regulations began to rein in industrial pollution. It is shocking and revelatory to witness coal's blackness spread across the urban landscape in the not so distant past. This image in particular resonated with me as I recalled childhood visits into the city from Willow Grove and my experience of the darkness inside and around the Philadelphia Zoo and the Reading Terminal Market, which were distinctly grittier places in the 1960s. Coal above ground and the railways that hauled it into the city shaped and colored the 20th century built environment. Dislocated, pulverized, and burned, coal transforms into soot, smoke, tar, asphalt, and fine carbon particulates. The artwork on the right is one of a series of experimental works on paper responding to the historical materials I was examining, including Aero Service photographs such as this one picturing the Delaware River waterfront in 1925. The materials that make up the image include soot, powdered coal, coal mine tailings, and carbon fiber. In a serendipitous encounter, I came across a pamphlet of photogravures from 1888, pictured here. The stunning images instigated a detour to learn about the oil boom in Western Pennsylvania that began in the 1860s. The shocking images of exploitation led me to think about coal within a broader context of energy culture. While the proto-industrial braced wooden form of the oil derrick are now absent from the modern landscape, they are echoed in the soaring steel and iron cell towers, industrial trestles, and electric transmission pylons that are now ubiquitous symbols of industry and technology. The echo of these industrial forms through time is an epitome of graphic entanglement, and they are a featured visual element in my recent artwork. An image from the same pamphlet shows an oil refinery in full bloom in 1888 with a cluster of large oil tanks and smokestacks. An Aero Service photograph shows the evolution of the oil refining industry only 40 years later in the Grays Ferry and Point Breeze neighborhood of Philadelphia. The third image is of the same location in 2020. The 1888 photogravure points relentlessly and darkly towards a future reality that we now inhabit. Coming to grips with this legacy of extraction is the imaginative project of our age, and historical images like these provide critical perspective. In a similarly prescient way, another image from the pamphlet shows a plume of black smoke billowing from a burning oil tank. Notice the gathering of witnesses to the event, an early example of disaster tourism. In February of this year, when I saw the images and news of the Palestine, Ohio chemical spill and burn-off, the historical image immediately sprung to my mind in a weird compression of time. Historical images of coal and oil, transmitted through time, deepen and complicate our experience of the here and now, and help us rewrite inherited assumptions about energy abundance and what constitutes a good life. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. And Alexis is up next. Let me get to the stop share. Oh, goodness. I'm just trying to get the stop share button there. Did I do it?
You did it. Thank you, Andrea.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you again, Andrea. That is fascinating, and I can't wait to discuss with you further. I am going to talk about the chapter of my dissertation that I researched just recently at the library company. But first, I wanted to thank everyone who I encountered at the library company who was exceptionally friendly and helpful, but especially Erika, Piola, who has the very strange habit of apologizing every time she would bring me the most useful visual material. Every day I would come in and there'd be something new on my desk and she'd say, I'm sorry. And it would be like mind-blowingly wonderful. So thank you for that, Erika. So the chapter of my dissertation that I was working on is called Buildings in the Landscape and the Architecture of Statehood. My dissertation project broadly is about prints that were made of the American West between the Mexican-American War and the Civil War. And I argue that we can't make sense of these prints without taking into account the debate over slavery extension into the American West that precipitated the Civil War. And so this chapter concerns the Simpson expedition, which was an expedition into the New Mexico Territory in 1849. And Richard Kern, an artist from Philadelphia, was appended to this expedition to make drawings of the landscape and whatever else they might encounter there, to be collected along with Lieutenant Simpson's reporting into a bound volume that would be published and distributed at first to members of Congress and the War Department, and then eventually sold widely to the American public. And my argument in this chapter is that Richard Kern, he has a brother Edward who painted this portrait, that Richard Kern uses the images that he makes of New Mexico as a way of subtly advocating for New Mexico free statehood. So when New Mexico was acquired from Mexico as a territory, the debate over whether it would become a slave or a free state was quite vehement at the time, occasionally erupting in violent clashes, actually. And Richard Kern was anti-expansion, anti-slavery, and the case that I'm making is that he uses, well, here, let me show you these images that he makes. So he uses these very strange architectural images of New Mexico to paint a picture of the territory as one inherently suited to free statehood, and specifically by imbuing the New Mexico landscape with elements of Philadelphia architecture. So I was on the hunt at the library company for what pieces of Philadelphia Richard Kern had sort of hidden throughout the New Mexico landscape. So I'll just run through a few similarities and things that I found in my research. So the first thing that I was delighted to find was that my assumption that Richard Kern had specific interest in depicting architecture seems to be correct. The library company has a number of his drawings, and this is not a cherry-picked sampling. All of his drawings are of Philadelphia architecture, so that felt like a great start. And so I'll start with this image. I had a sense before coming to the library company and before even visiting Philadelphia that this looked like Eastern State Penitentiary, this little thing. And I think I was right, but we can definitely discuss further. I found many, many very useful images of Eastern State, which confirmed for me that Kern was not only thinking of the actual place itself when he was in Philadelphia, in New Mexico, but thinking of the visual culture of representations of Philadelphia and participating in that as well. This other image, I didn't know what to do with before I came to the library company, but I had a feeling it must be something. Specifically, these sort of little dwellings on the hillside, which are just sandstone formations. And I found these images of Manayunk, which I'm happy to go back to later if we want to look at them longer. So I'm very excited to investigate what I think is a visual similarity here, especially given the prevalence in Manayunk of cotton mills and the entanglement of the Southern cotton economy in the Northern economy, even if you were, an anti-expansionist, anti-slavery person. And then the final image I'll show you is this, these natural sandstone formations, where Kern says that this formation here that reminds him of William Penn, the little piece on the right there. He says it's a tankard where the handle is William Penn. So perhaps. And then the foreground is actually of greater interest. I'm going to skip this. So this, basically I make a claim that these arches in this image are related to burned out churches that Kern would have seen after the nativist riots that took place in Philadelphia in the mid 1840s, right before he left to go to the West. So I'll end there so as to not take too much time, but it was certainly very fruitful, and I have many, many more comparative images that I'm eager to discuss. So I'll hand it off now to Philippa. Thank you.
All right, let's see. Can everyone see my screen? Hopefully.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Erika. That moment of paranoia when you're like, what am I seeing and what is everyone else seeing? Alexis, it was such a joy to see your images, and Andrea to see yours again. And it really is just such a pleasure to be here and in such great company, even virtually. I was at the library company for 5 weeks this fall, and I can say that my time with the collections, with the staff, with you, Erika, and in conversation with so many people has fundamentally improved my dissertation project, and really was an absolute joy. My dissertation, Pharmacopic Dreams, works to bring a critical disability studies lens to art history by tracing artistic engagement with health and wellness. And in particular, I look at the early 19th century America, which is a moment when these dialogues really came to the forefront of the national discourse, as encapsulated by this wonderful LCP images of Lady Liberty sitting atop a medicine chest with a bald eagle bearing pharmaceutical scales in its beak, and ships bravely sailing into the rough seas behind. This elaborate yet minute engraving is how one 19th century pharmacy chose to represent their drug and medicine business. Health is so often framed in terms of individual pathology, something that falls within this domain of medicine, pharmacology, and public health, and can be defined by a narrative of disease, diagnosis, cure. But the lived experience of health, sickness, and everything in between is not only far more complex, but many determinants of whether one is considered sick or disabled are not contained within the body at all. They are created by the shape of the society which surrounds us, how it builds its environments, which bodies it stigmatizes, how narrowly it defines that normative body. Health is also not one's own. From public health to the national body, the pursuit of health is national policy. In the past 30 years, advances in class, gender, race, and queer theory have radically reshaped our scholarly practice. I argue that disability is a fifth intersectional plane that works alongside these theories to expand and unsettle our work. By reconceptualizing ableism as a societal structure instead of an individual behavior, we can see how these ideologies are created across a wide range of cultural and visual production. And this is particularly important because debility, sickness, and medical treatment are not marginal, but marginalized experiences. They recur in unfixed and changeable ways across almost all lives. So what did this look like in the early 19th century? The LCP collections actually offer a wonderful window into that world. This was a time when faith was rapidly ebbing away from beliefs in a body that was controlled by a balance of humors, which, when interrupted, could be rebalanced using purging or bloodletting. But the general Jacksonian distrust for authority and expertise really fanned the flames of a very real fear of doctors and their treatments, which, as hinted at in this comic Valentine, seemed to kill as often as they saved. To fill this vacuum, we see a rising interest in alternative therapies, but no consensus on what those should be. So this is the age of homeopathy, magnetism, electric, eclectic, faith, spiritual, mesmeric, anything and everything could be medicine. Through the aggressive campaigning of these alternative medical providers, the United States became what they termed a medical democracy, where all regulations over the use, sale, and manufacture of drugs were struck down one by one in the name of a freedom to choose one's own healthcare. Any and all treatments, however hazardous, were allowed to compete in an open market of public opinion, and medicine became subject to the general laissez-faire, buyer beware Jacksonian market ethos. This produces two things. One, medicine becomes what sociologist Anne Cronin terms a commodity of no substance. No one knows what is in a medicine bottle or what it might do. Medicine is a thing that is sold not on scientific merit, but on these associative strings by which manufacturers connected their drugs to ideas of wealth, virtue, class, gender performance. And here we're seeing two designs for soda fountains, which was a healthful drink at the time. Advertisers and artists, more so than doctors and scientists, constituted the public meaning around medicine. Second, medicine became a dominant part of social discourse through a flurry of media in advertising, but also policy initiatives, popular science, swathes of news coverage that extended throughout society. We see it in theater, in comics, it's a joke in parlor games. Here we see leeches turned into trains, creeping across a patient who lies beneath a patchwork blanket of debts, taxes, and expenses. These pharmacopic dreamworks, as I'm calling them, these hopes, aspirations, fears, and discourses that surround drugs are so much more than the pills themselves. Taken together, we find pharmacopic visions that recur across a wide range of cultural production and entwine with things like democratic freedom, expansionist imperial desire, and rising ideals of self-reliance. Hence why a picture of medicine that focuses on doctors, disease models, and scientific discovery will miss the broader picture of how pharmacopic ideas entwined with almost all aspects of American society. So this is what my project does. It looks for a history of medicine outside of the clinic, and one which centers patients, not providers, and one that explores the cultural construction of medicine, which is why the Library Company of Philadelphia was uniquely poised to support this kind of project, thanks to the generosity of two men in particular, William H. Helfland and Charles Rosenberg. These two men collected advertisements, billheads, product labels, trade cards, games, comic prints, popular medical texts, books, and ephemera, the kind of things that rarely survive. And this collection allows us access to a very different kind of record from which we can write a very different kind of history. There's a tendency to perceive patients as passive, vulnerable, subject to the instruction of doctors, or dismissed as irrational and non-compliant. This is particularly true of the 19th century when we read of patients being duped or preyed upon by unscrupulous medical providers. What this record shows, however, is an extensive process of making meaning around fundamentally unknowable substances in ways that both challenged and re-entrenched existing power structures, and that was charged by the pursuit of knowledge, and that fueled a medical manifest destiny for the discovery and extraction of pharmaceuticals. This is the history that I'm hoping to write through visual culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippa, Alexis, and Andrea for introducing your the work that you did at the library company and the projects you're working on now. That was wonderful. I thought to start tonight's conversation, I wanted to ask each of you if you could just spend a few moments discussing what propelled and inspired you to pursue your subjects of research, and hopefully that'll give folks some time to put questions into the Q&A. And no worries if we're still waiting for them. I have other questions for you. So why don't we go in the order that the introductions were, if that makes sense? So Andrea, if you don't mind starting.
Yeah, sure. I started thinking about coal in the most unlikely of places, and it happened to be during a trip to the Arctic Circle in this Norwegian town of Longyearbyen, where they're mining coal. They've been mining coal since the early 1900s, and they're closing down those coal mines now. So returning from that trip with a new curiosity about coal, I began to investigate coal as a local feature and an important, and prominent feature of Pennsylvania's history. So that was my entree, thinking about Pennsylvania anthracite coal after returning from the Arctic Circle.
Thank you. Alexis?
Yeah, so I guess the way that I approached my topic more broadly, I think, was with because of a dissatisfaction I felt, I think, with the visual images that dominate one's study of landscape representation in the 1850s. I mean, the Hudson River School is really what you learn about and what all the books are on. And so I was, in the art history world, learning about that. And then also early in graduate school, taking a history course at CUNY on sort of the preamble of the Civil War. And the political crisis of the 1850s didn't seem really anywhere represented in Hudson River. I mean, you can make cases for how politics imbue Hudson River School painting, but the debate was so much about the West, the fate of the West, the future of the West. But when you look, art historically, you have like your trappers and fur traders in the West, and then like kind of, TV static noise, well, this, in the Civil War period. And then afterwards you have the photographic surveys and Bierstadt. But I wanted to know what happened in that blip. And so I started digging for images of the West, and I found thousands and thousands and thousands of them that are all sponsored by the government. So they're actually kind of right under everyone's noses. That's visual culture for you.
Well, and I also between Andrea, you and Phil, I'll let you speak in just a moment. Forgive me for like inserting myself, but I'm also thinking sort of like the spectrum between fine art and popular art, what you were sort of getting at, that we thinking about the Hudson River Valley School, and that's often thought of as fine art, and potentially whatever social political messages or not social messages that you're receiving from that material, but that you can have the same aesthetic experience with a government report illustration in a report, and it's smaller format, but still receiving similar messages. But I'm sorry, Philippa, please talk about how you came to your project.
Never be sorry. It's such a fascinating conversation. And, my last chapter also jumps into landscape. So I feel like everyone, there's so much synergy here in thinking about how we look at land and what stories we tell about land and how visual culture constructs those narratives. For me, coming to my project was both a very long-term investment and a complete accident. I was looking through a comedy magazine from the 1850s, and I was looking for these taxonomical structures that were used to describe race. I had a hint and a footnote somewhere that they were in here. I thought that sounded interesting for a seminar paper. I'm flipping through digitally, and I get completely stopped by this image of a man strapped to a table being physically inflated like a water balloon. And I was like, okay, well, there we go. I had to look at it. And it turns out it was this entire suite of images that was a satirical account of medical treatment in the 1850s. And that sent me down this really interesting path of thinking about, well, what is going on here? And just the diversity of what was in that series and what was clearly already known to the point where it could be a joke. I had so much catching up to do to understand the series. And by the time I was caught up, I was hooked. But really the disability studies perspective came from the fact that I have worked in accessibility in museums for 10 years and had some amazing and wonderful mentors who really helped me rethink the way that I saw the world, because I think we all are trained in a very particular society with a very particular set of values about bodies. And so I was delighted to be able to dig into that academically, what I had been doing in practice for so long. So it was a wonderful marriage.
No, thank you. That's a really a great point at the end. It just made me think of an experience I had, and just sort of your physical engagement with the a print and or any image. And I was working with a class, and I was looking at something from an upside down, like the print was upside down to me, and I realized, oh, what I was interpreting as some kind of like just some wackadoodle sketch was a man in a hat, and it was. I was like, I now know what this person was sketching. And it was just sort of this serendipitous experience. But I was like, okay, I mean, just the way that I'm physically interacting with, turn it upside down, turn it around. I mean, that you can see something different or see what was intended, but you're missing it because you're looking at it from a literally different perspective. But anyway, that's enough about me. I wanted to ask just one more question for myself, indulge myself, and then I will open it up to the floor. Probably not a surprise, this question. It's stemming from the title. The title of tonight's program includes the words entanglement, assessments, and entwinements. And I know some of you already were speaking about that in your introductory remarks, but could you speak a little bit more to how all or one of these terms relates to your works with graphic material? And I'm going to cheat a little bit. It could also just, for our LCP of folks out there, if you could also maybe talk about a serendipitous or surprising or unexpected find for your project from LCP's collection. Take either one of those. Either one is great. Thank you.
Could I just jump in? I wanted to follow up on the first question a little bit, which also relates to this serendipitous findings, is that when I started thinking about Cole and looking at the collections, I was just astounded at the quantity of graphic images depicting this material underground, which is an unseen thing. And they were doing everything in their scientific power to represent an underground world. So I completely responded to those kind of images that were fantastical imaginings based on the best of their estimates. So I thought that whole process was just one of serendipity, and then the quantity of materials that were generated by the surveyors and the geologists and the industry was just really astounding, and a continual source of inspiration for how I thought about coal and how I thought about resources and nature and unseen things in our world that have a profound effect once they're brought to light and removed from where they belong. So that's my comment on serendipity. That was pretty astounding.
Thank you. Alexis, Philippa, please feel free. Okay, Alexis, unmute herself. Go.
It's so difficult to choose just one. I felt like being at the LCP was like one delightful surprise after another, truly. And Erika can vouch that I was like, and this will be my next side project, and that will be my next side. Like it was wonderful. But I think to sort of attempt to combine answers to both questions. I think when, deep in making this argument about Richard Kern's anti-slavery images of the New Mexico territory, it's easy to reduce an artist to their work and then to ascribe some like ideological purity, if not purity in the moral sense, then certainly just like a singularity or clarity of vision. And returning to the source and seeing other work that they've done is such an important reminder that although perhaps the emanations and ramifications of these images might have a particular political meaning, the intention behind their creation is much more complicated, and further, the just political or even personal biases of their creators are more complicated. So I had seen in just like a tiny citation when I was looking something up in the LCP catalog that Kern had done an illustration for one of the journals for the American Philosophical Society. And I was like, oh, great, I can't wait to see what this is. It's going to be so useful. And because everything I'd found until that point was like, yes, like we got our architectural images by Kern, like, it was perfect. And I went in with an eye to find something else like that. And I was flipping through images and images, and I wasn't seeing, like Del R. Kern anywhere. And I was like, what? I can't, and I couldn't see anything that seemed like it was by his hand. And so I was like, I give up, maybe it's a mistake. But Erika went back and found it. And it was totally my own bias as a historian looking for what I wanted to find. I missed these like kind of terrible ethnographic drawings of ancient Egyptian kings and queens that Kern did. And so now side project number 10 from the LCP is sort of figuring that out, and how, especially because I didn't include these images, but Kern did do many sort of ethnographic portraits of indigenous people that he encountered in the New Mexico territory. But those struck me as, quite sensitive and personal and not stereotypical. And so I would love to investigate this sort of entanglement between what seems to be two almost irreconcilable political viewpoints.
I'd love to echo so much of what Alexis says, actually, because I felt like it's similar experience. Everything I was doing was a side project, because if you walk into the LCP's collections, especially for me working with the Helflin collection, which was just joy, I had too many side projects. But one of the things that actually relates to a wonderful question that Christine just put in the chat about the physical encounter with the work, I had the benefit that a lot of the materials I was excited to see had been digitized. And so I had a sneak preview. I had actually already been using them in conference presentations, and then getting to the library company and thinking about how to recreate the actual conditions of vision in which you would have encountered these objects. Because especially when we're looking at advertisements, trade cards, billheads in particular, I now have an article on billheads. We're really thinking about very, very, very tiny images, and there's an enormous investment of labor in creating details that are less than a millimeter high and that actually are impossible to see without a magnifying glass. So I can't tell you how many days Erika, Andrea, and I were standing over these with magnifying glasses, thinking about that. And that produced this entire set of questions about the distortion of the lens and the movement of the magnifying glass and the way it created this wonderful, almost cinematic effect, and the distortions in that, that I knew I needed to see them in person, but discovering why I needed to see them in person was just such a highlight, and I still stuck in my brain. So thank you for distracting me from my dissertation again, Erika.
Happy to do that. I'm always looking for other people's, first, second, third book projects after the dissertation or whatever, or art project. I'm there. And it's also for you to come back to the library company, to the graphic arts department, look at the book collections and look at our materials related to visual culture. But I've indulged myself with a few questions for you. So we do have some questions in the Q&A. So I'm just going to head to those. and start up. And I know there's one from Nick, and forgive me, Nick, I'm gonna massacre your last name. But there, I believe Nick is asking about what part of Philadelphia, a photo that you showed, Andrea. I think it was the tent, the Aero Service when showing the tents. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was like 11th and Erie. I had the slide actually noted the place, but if I remember correctly, it was 11th and Erie, so close to the Delaware River-ish.
Thank you.
North
Hopefully
Philly.
that I got the right slide, and Nick, that answers your question. Feel free to type again if I misconstrued anything. I now have a question for Philippa from Megan Hines. Were there any pandemics or society-wide health scares that changed the visual landscape during your period of study?
Yes. I'm looking really 1800 to 1860. The 1860 is the cutoff because of the obvious enormous health impacts of the Civil War, which really changed medicine. But we do have a number of intervening wars and conflicts that obviously happened between 1800 and 1860. There's also things that are endemic. So sort of cholera in particular creates a very specific set of relationships where who gets cholera, how is that related to their behavior, their class. This is before germ theory, so really one is speculating. And in my third chapter, I actually spend a lot of time tracing vegetable medicines and the way in which they're understood, vegetables both as being a less dangerous, less violent form of medicine, but also these real fears around that around vegetables that happen with cholera epidemics. So you really need a lot of persuasion to happen in this sphere that coincides with botanical imagery. And we have this real preoccupation with botanical imagery as purely decorative. It's very easy to dismiss. It is really doing this powerful cultural work. And a lot of that comes from this sort of ebb and flow and then the Thompsonian movement. But yes, your question is really insightful in terms of how those things change our visual culture.
Yeah, I mean, that's, sort of always talking about, our social construction of our visual world and the visual construction of our social world, like that there's an entwinement and an entanglement there, yada, yada. So I have a question from Michael Leja, who, supported a couple of your, helped support your fellowships. It says, thank you for all your fascinating presentations. It's a question for all of you. How did the images you're studying circulate and to what sorts of audiences?
I think most of the Aero Service photographs that I was really honing in on were aerial surveys commissioned by industrialists, I think, to get an overview of the placement of their enterprises. I don't know, Erika probably knows more about the Aero Service long history of their work. Getting aerial views of the region. It seems like a long, complicated history, the Aero Service industry. But yeah, I believe it was mostly for industry.
Yeah, and I think we also do have some images from the Aero Service Corporation that are showing estates. So it's sort of, wealthy individuals also commissioning these aerial photographers to get views of their, land development. Yeah, I mean, sort of what you were saying, Andrea, and the collection ranges and dates from the late 1920s into the 1950s that we have these materials. Thank you. Oh, let me, Alexis, Philippa. Please answer. Please answer.
Thank you for the question, Michael, and thank you for supporting our research. So as I mentioned, the images that Richard Curran made were included in a bound volume that was a report written by Lieutenant Simpson following the expedition. It was commissioned by the US government, and the printing, the publication was funded by the government. The original print run that was commissioned, was 8,000 copies, something like that. So it was quite a lot. Definitely, of course, more than members of Congress would account for instance. So this went out to all branches of government, really. And then the printers that received these commissions from the government would often then privately just print more and sell them because, no one had seen images of the West. It wasn't even a part of the United States until 1848. So people were hungry for images of the West, and these private printers would either reprint the entire survey report, or sometimes they would reprint just the lithographs and sell those separately. And then something else that happened is that collectors started cutting the lithographs out of the published report. So if you go to a museum that has a suspicious number of government lithographs, they've probably been excised from some reports which are missing theirs. And it's very common to find reports that are missing lithographs. But there are truly thousands and thousands, like on the order of millions of these prints out there that are just circulating and floating around. I myself bought 2 at a flea market. So there you can find them widely.
This is a wonderful question, and definitely a hard one to answer. I think in terms of medical imagery and medical rhetoric, you can safely say that it's everywhere in this period. A lot of scholars basically define newspaper publishing and patent medicine advertising as growing up side by side, inextricably interlinked, because patent medicine advertisers are really the ones funding through their campaigns, a lot of these early newspapers. So they are definitely inundating people. What I think I'm interested in doing chapter by chapter is sort of recreating the conditions of vision around a specific object or a specific idea, which gets really interesting because then chapter by chapter, you can try and figure out, okay, for this group of people who are associating with this, this particular question or this particular belief. My last chapter looks at Frederick Edwin Church and the people who are seeing the Heart of the Andes. What are the people who would have gone to see the Heart of the Andes seeing in the theater? What are they consuming in their books that they might read? And I'm particularly interested in the way that, for example, they're seeing representations of Peru in the Andes and cinchona, which we now know as quinine, which we now know as tonic water, which actually was one of the most effective antifebrils, a fever treatment of the time. How is that sort of set of things that they would have seen as urban viewers of a certain class going to inform what they bring to that work of art? So for me, that question really is at the heart of what each chapter does in trying to recreate how are these circulating and what are they circulating among? Like what is next to them in that room or in that pile of papers?
Great, thank you all. Another question. This is from Christine Nelson. Thank you all. Would you please talk about a collection item you encountered at the library company, which I think some of you, we discussed a little bit, for which the physical encounter with the item was essential, something that would not have had the same impact on you had you only seen a digital surrogate. And I know, Philippa, you addressed it, you might want to skip responding, which is fine, but Alexis and Andrea, if you don't mind.
I can just respond quickly. I wish I had such a compelling tale as Philippa's with the magnifying glass. That was lovely. I think for me, I guess I'll just say that it's very hard when you're only doing digital research to not just search what you're already looking for. It's hard to have those serendipitous encounters. And I think Erika very heroically brought me so many views of Philadelphia from the 1840s and 50s, prints and photographs. And there was something about being able to just physically sort through hundreds and hundreds of photographs of streets in Philadelphia that really drove home, I think, the feeling of being there in the 1840s and 50s. And the way, for instance, that walking down, a narrow city street with tall buildings might have felt similar to Kern, when he walked through a canyon in the Southwest, and how it wasn't just, oh, I see that sandstone formation and that reminds me of Eastern State Penitentiary. It's perhaps there's an undercurrent of analogous experience, right? And I don't think that I ever would have made that connection if I hadn't just been like physically drowning in images of Philadelphia. So that was crucial.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Alexis. Just the fact of being with experts like Erika and the rest of the library company staff who can just bring together these unexpected associations. In fact, that oil pamphlet that I spent so much time with was brought to me um, down in the reading room just by looking through some card catalog cards, just like that. And it was, about oil. And I was like, well, maybe it's not quite the thing, but let's look at it anyway. And it was just full of this unexpected richness and associations that really enriched my entire project and deepened it. So yeah, the idea of being on site with the collection is just huge. And the other thing that I really appreciated being with the objects was that I could see the presence of soot on the objects that had been in the collection in various locations in the various buildings where these books have been maintained, but parts of the collection haven't been cleaned or dusted or really scrubbed over. And so I really loved being able to interact with soot from the days when the book was in the collection, with the coal-fired stove going and getting soot all over everything.
Yeah, no, I love that. I always, those kinds of experiences with materials where you've seen, I don't know, like a random fingerprint or the soot or like someone's inscription or just something a little bit out of the ordinary, or what you're expecting. I feel like it tells it's like the history, the narrative, the personal story, the life cycle of that material, and it kind of, what is the life of an object kind of situation. But I do have a couple other questions. This one is for Alexis from Robert Finelli. Alexis, what do you think was going on in the mind of the artist who made the images of New Mexico? Was he consciously reusing visual elements from Philadelphia that he was familiar with and imposing them on the New Mexico landscape? Was he altering reality to make some point visually about Philadelphia, anti-slavery, and New Mexico?
I'm so sorry. My research assistant has insisted on participating in this answer. Thank you for that question. I try. Oh, his contribution is over. I try not to make claims about artists' intention necessarily, just because they're so hard to back up. And I mean, we have, Kern's journals and drawings and things from the expedition, but short of him saying, something explicit about, like, explicitly describing why he's making these drawings. To me, my argument follows the track of what people who are viewing these prints would have necessarily interpreted them as meaning politically. So, I mean, I think it's certainly fair to say that Kern has the architecture of Philadelphia in mind. And I think, a preponderance of images of Philadelphia architecture imposed on New Mexico inevitably would lead a viewer then to conclude, I claim, that there is this architecture of statehood in the New Mexico landscape. So if you try to bring slavery to New Mexico, it's like bringing slavery back into the city of Philadelphia. And this is the late 1840s sort of revisionist history of, in Kern's mind, of Philadelphia as, the Philadelphia of William Penn, of this free Quaker city, with all of these, civic works and democratic elements, right? These aren't just random architectural pieces, but each is a sort of point of pride of the city as a city of democracy, of free enterprise, right? So whether or not Kern was intending a specific political point, I think is subordinate to the fact that political point is very much there in the images, especially by the time you get to the end of the narrative, and I've seen so many of them.
Thank you, Alexis. And I just have to say, I remember like your first day at the library company and you talking about, because you were staying near Eastern State Penitentiary and being so excited to be like, yes, I think this, seeing the real, the actual building. I mean, I think that plays into right. Like, so you have the visual image and the graphic and the allusion to it in the government report, and then you have the physical building that you're seeing it in these three different perspectives and tying them all together. But I digress. Like get to have a few more questions. And I think I know it's getting close to 6:30, but I think hopefully we can get through the next few questions, and if folks can hopefully stay a few minutes, that would be great. This is a question from Edith Mulhern. She says this question brings together all three topics. I was wondering if you encountered images that promote the Southwest as being healthful and having pure air for tuberculosis patients, especially in contrast to industrial cities.
I can just quickly go first to get myself out of the way. No, I have not. I was just a little bit early, I think, in the images that I have looked at, early in the sense that the Southwest was 1 year old, as within the jurisdiction of the United States, and at the oldest 10 years in what I've looked at. So the sort of visual rhetoric or national rhetoric of what the Southwest was still being worked out in that time, and the discussion was so dominated by whether or not the Southwest would be open to slavery that sort of other functions are harder to find. So.
I can jump in. I haven't particularly looked at air because in terms of pharmaceuticals, air is much harder to sell as a commodity. That's not to say nobody didn't, because I'm sure somebody tried. I have seen a lot of things for waters. You see a lot of curative waters. Those are actually bottled. There's also a fantastic PhD candidate at Yale, Michaela Hefner, who's doing her dissertation a little bit later and looking at that circulation of healthful air. So her work is fantastic, and she would be the person to answer your question. I can say that what I have seen is this, what I'm calling a medical manifest destiny. So this idea of US expansion and the projection of sort of a sphere of influence, which I primarily chart looking at Peru, because the heart of the Andes, and because also I have a particular interest in sort of the indigenous cost of extraction in Peru around cinchona and other remedies. But the other option I was looking at was Southern California into Mexico, because that was another space that was really seen as having a lot of pharmacological potential. And so you do see these travelogues that are also selling medicines that talk about trips through the Southwest, that talk about trips through California, that are in discovery of these new plants. And there is this fabulous, somebody actually built a depot in New York that was styled in this sort of Spanish Baroque missionary architecture, that they actually apparently built that facade into the streets of New York to try and move this fantasy into the physical reality of the city. So it is absolutely there. I am sure that someone tried to do air as well. It just wasn't as saleable a commodity, so it hasn't come across my desk.
In terms of coal, I can only go as far west as Pittsburgh, and there was much written about the air quality in Pittsburgh compared to the eastern seaboard cities where we were burning anthracite, and in Pittsburgh it was the bituminous coal, and it was just a real hazard, and there were, disastrous effects and deaths and terrible poisonous fogs happening in Pittsburgh that didn't happen in Philadelphia and New York.
Thank you for ending on that light note, Andrea. No, I have, there's a comment and then I'll read a final question. And I just, thank you, everyone for sticking around with us a couple more minutes. This is a comment from Karen Reeds. She said, I had the privilege of knowing Bill Helfand and getting his help on my first exhibition. He would have been delighted at knowing how imaginatively you've used his collections. I envy you the opportunity to spend so much time at the library company. And then we have a question from Francis Paul. It says, thank you all for your stimulating comments. Initially, it's to Alexis. You compare the Kern lithographs prints to photographs of Philadelphia. Can you say something about the relationship between the two media, both in the context of the Simpson expedition and in the context of imaging the West in general at this time? And then Francis then followed up saying, you know, her question, there's a relationship between graphic art prints and photographs that would be relevant to Philippa and Andrea's work. So Alexis, if you don't mind starting, and then we'll conclude.
Thank you for that question. I often disappoint people by telling them I don't work on photographs of the West, because there just weren't photographs of the West yet in this time. And just the technology was not yet there, right? Bringing daguerreotype equipment even to the West was very challenging, much less through and across the West. And some people did try. And there was an expedition led by John C. Fremont, and he brought a photographer. And you know, the donkey that was loaded up with all of the daguerreotype plates, like, got spooked and ran off, and like there went, you know, all of the photographs from that expedition. So the like contingencies are just too high. Oh, there was my other favorite is someone tried to bring photographic equipment in the mid 1850s up the Colorado River, so like up the Grand Canyon, not with the current, against the current, and it is in the Colorado River somewhere now. So in any case, I am fascinated by these images. I almost said my images, if that lets you know how attached one becomes as a researcher. These images of the Southwest, because they're made at this moment just before photography has a real foothold in visual representation, I think, and before photography, I want to say, becomes normative or normativizing in terms of expectations of how reality might be represented. And so I think, although there were, you know, many photographic representations of Philadelphia that I reference, they were taken in the 1850s, and therefore I was using them to get a sense of how Kern might have experienced the lived environment of Philadelphia, but he would never have seen those photographs because they post-dated his trips to the Southwest. He didn't return to Philadelphia. So yeah, I mean, I think that just the potential for manipulating the landscape without, you know, fear or anxiety that the real image might like creep back up. It was just, that's just such a unique moment where that was possible. And, you know, manipulating the landscape to make these rather radical, in some cases, political points, I just find so fascinating. So.
Andrea, you should go next, because I think your answer will be much more interesting than mine. I'm excited for your answer.
I was just giving this some thought. I mean, looking at those Aeroservice photographs and also the photograph yours, it became so heavy for me to look at them. They're such incontrovertible proof of a past that, you know, the future's past that we're living in right now. It just carried such a different weight to the much sort of lighter and semi-imaginative depictions of this underground world of coal in the previous phase of my research. So that was a kind of unexpected emotional fallout of absorbing image after image after image of this environmental devastation. Yeah, powerful.
I can say, just looking at the few I looked at over your shoulder, there were some incredible photographs that you were looking at and thinking about.
Yeah, very powerful medium.
For my project, there is some photography, and Tanya Sheehan's written a wonderful book about photography and medicine and their interactions, and has said everything that I think I would want to say. She does a beautiful job of thinking about how the chemicals of photography and the chemicals of medicine and the status of photographers and the status of physicians really dovetailed to create a sort of shared set of advantages and problems, I would say. But I think the heart of this question really is right where my project is looking at the movement of ideas and images across different media. I think in art history, and I come from an art history department, we're so often encouraged to say, okay, well, this is a photograph and this is a print and this is a painting. And it just, for me, the way that I really get excited about thinking about these images is thinking about the visual ecosystem in which they functioned, and how even if it's a print, is there a photograph that's already seen, or to Alexis's point, a photograph that you know can't be seen? And how does that set up a set of relationships? And I had the most wonderful encounter 2 weeks ago where Billhead, the one that I included in my presentation of the Lady Liberty, somebody spotted it on a sailor's woolly, which is something that would have been made on board a ship. So someone is doing an embroidery that is pulling the imagery from a billhead. That movement of ideas and images across media is exactly what I think is so interesting about this kind of work and visual culture projects in general.
That was a great way to end, I gotta say, Phil. Thank you so much. All Philippa, Andrea, Alexis, thank you for this really stimulating conversation and more and food for thought about visual culture and your really important work. I think with what, like I said, what you're doing with the intersection of visual culture and social political questions of the past and the present. So thank you. And thank you everyone for hanging with us a few extra minutes after 6:30. I also want to thank Allison Kronstadt, who was our behind the scenes guru, helping things go smoothly this evening. So again, just one final thank you to everyone attending, to the panelists, and have a wonderful evening. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. All right. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.